Hey, well, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show on Reason and Theology. Going to talk about some really important distinctions concerning the question of whether or not Catholics can criticize the Pope according to the magisterium. So this comes up because I've noticed there's a lot of confusion about some really important and basic distinctions that are often overlooked whenever this discussion comes up, and we need to review them once more. I'm going to put these distinctions right here on the screen. You should be able to see them here. And these are four distinctions I want you to keep in mind as we talk about this question of can Catholics criticize the Pope? Now, those four distinctions are as follows: destructive criticism, constructive criticism, withholding assent, and dissent. If you don't know the distinction between these four, that's what this video is for. And it will help you and equip you in the future to know what can and can't be done according to the magisterium. So that's what we have in store for today. Let me remind y'all, hit that subscribe button. Really would appreciate your support, and the like button while you're at it. Okay, let's start with the first one. I'm going to just briefly define these terms, and then we're going to take a more in-depth look at them. But let me just briefly define all four right at the outset. That way you're not just left waiting for an answer at the very end or something like that. Destructive criticism. This is going to be whenever we criticize someone to just harm their reputation. Perhaps it's bearing false witness, slander, or we're criticizing them in such a way that it's not meant to build them up, but it's just there to tear them down, to bring them down in some kind of way. That's destructive criticism. Does the church allow for destructive criticism of the magisterium, the teaching authority of the church, i.e., the Pope and the College of Bishops? No. In fact, it doesn't allow for destructive criticism of anyone. The catechism is very clear. Slander, bearing false witness, things like that is grave matter. And of course, we know the New Testament lists that sin, among others, right next to the sin of homosexuality. And it says people who do these things will not inherit eternal life. So no, the magisterium does not allow for destructive criticism. But what about constructive criticism? Offering some kind of criticism here, perhaps of the behavior of the Pope or the College of Bishops, in a way that's constructive. It's not meant to tear them down. It's not meant to insult them. It's actually meant to build them up. But it's giving them some feedback, constructive feedback that you think is necessary, not only for them, but also for the benefit of the audience, for the hearers. Constructive criticism. Is that allowed for? Yes. Yes. Canon 212, as I've often pointed out many times. Got a whole show on it called that. So Canon 212 allows for this kind of constructive criticism. So does the document by the Vatican, Donum Veritatis. And so that's allowed. So, if the Pope does something incredibly imprudent or says something wrong or imprudent or harmful, can people constructively criticize the Pope for that? Yes. Not only can they, but in some cases they're obligated to, depending on the context. In some cases they may have an obligation to, and if they don't, they themselves are in sin for not offering that criticism. Okay. So withholding assent, now that's different. People often confuse criticism with terms like assent, withholding assent, and dissent. So withholding assent is something that the magisterium per Donum Veritatis allows in very rare cases for well-trained theologians who are fully informed on a particular matter. If they have a difficulty in somehow harmonizing two teachings of the magisterium and assuming both of these teachings are non-definitive in nature, non-infallible, if you will. In the case of non-definitive teachings, let's say perhaps Pope Francis says something on the death penalty, and you're really struggling with, well, how does that work out with Romans? How does that work out with this and that in the magisterium? And a well-trained theologian is doing his best to try to harmonize them, but he just can't do so. The magisterium allows for, in rare cases like that, in cases of non-definitive acts of the magisterium, a person could privately withhold assent. That is, they don't assent to the proposition, they don't accept with their intellect and will that proposition that they find conflicting with another proposition of the magisterium. That's called withholding assent. But that is not to be confused with dissent. Dissent, per donum veritatis, is never allowed. Dissent, per the Acts of Constantinople 4, 869 to 870, is never allowed. There is an anathema attached to any Catholic who does this in regards to the papacy. So if you are not only dissenting, rejecting a teaching of the church, even if it's non-definitive, and you're then going in public and you're rejecting it publicly, that's known as dissent. So withholding assent is I'm not assenting to the proposition. Dissent is I'm publicly going out and going against it, speaking against it, teaching against it. Withholding assent is not necessarily teaching against it or going against it, but it's a inability to assent to it. But one is still respectfully open to what the magisterium says, and they're reserved. They're not out to point out that the church is teaching heresy, stuff like that. No. And again, Dona Veritatis makes this important distinction. Dissent is not allowed. And again, in the case of Constantinople 4, there are some anathemas attached in particular cases. We'll talk about them here in a moment. But these are some really important distinctions that we have to keep in mind. And if we don't have these distinctions in mind, we're going to misunderstand everything. If I've done like videos, for instance, on how the magisterium says that you can't dissent against its teachings, and people will always inevitably come back and say, that's ridiculous. So you're saying you can never criticize the church? No, that's not what I said. There's a difference between criticism and dissent, but it just tells me that the person isn't grasping the distinction. Or an even maybe less common case is somebody might have the wherewithal to know about Dona Veritatis allowing a theologian to not assent to something. And so if I mention about how the magisterium says that you can't dissent, they'll say, but wait, Dona Veritatis allows for it. No. Dona Veritatis allows for you to withhold assent in rare cases. It does not allow for dissent. It has over 11 paragraphs condemning dissent. So these are really important things that I think we need to keep in mind. I want to show you something real quick that precipitated this. Okay, you should be able to see it on your screen. There's a comment that I just got not long ago at all. It says, most bishops probably agree that criticizing a bishop is a grave sin, though there are hardly any sins anymore. But that one they would keep. Okay. So I point out, actually, it's not a grave sin to criticize a bishop. Here I'm talking about the constructive criticism, right? Not destructive. It's not a grave sin to criticize a bishop, or even a pope for that matter, let alone for a bishop to do that about another bishop. It is actually sinful not to in the particular case that we were discussing. That particular case is irrelevant for what I'm pointing out here. But to not criticize in some cases could be sinful, right? Okay. Now, I got this comment from someone else. Excuse me. I got this comment from someone else. But Lofton, you think the Pope cannot be criticized, right? You keep labeling anyone who called out the Pope. Now, do you catch the problem? Based on what we just reviewed, do you see the problem? Okay. So, do I think that the Pope can't be criticized? Well, um, oddly enough, I have dozens of videos saying that you can criticize the Pope and doing just that. Here's just one of them. Look at when it was posted, December 6, 2023. It's even called, Can Catholics Criticize the Pope? And of course, I say in the video, yes, you can criticize the Pope. I'll actually play it for you just to humor those who haven't seen it. You can criticize some things in the hierarchy. I mean, canon law certainly allows for that. Canon 212, as I've noted many times, you can express your opinion. And yes, that opinion can be critical. Right. Got a whole video titled, Can Catholics Criticize the Pope? So when somebody asks, straw mans me like this, it says, Lofton, you think that the Pope can't be criticized? I have to wonder, where does this come from? It certainly doesn't come from my actual content, because my actual content shows over and over and over and over and over and over. I've said these things for years. So where does it come from? Well, it comes from priests and content creators who don't actually watch my content, haven't actually listened to my position, haven't even tried to consider my views, but they'll bear false witness and say things like, I believe you can't criticize Pope. And then they'll straw man me and then try to critique that. Well, anybody can knock down a straw man. But anybody who's being honest and sincere would be able to do a 5-second search on my YouTube channel and found that video where I clearly say, you can criticize Pope. Right? So anybody who has goodwill, anyone who's not bearing false witness, could have easily found that, right? That in addition to dozens of other videos. This is no secret. So what that tells me is, it tells me that some of these critics are not sincere. Why are they doing it? I don't know. I won't speculate. I'll leave God to judge their motives. But is it fair to my position? No. No, it's not. But not only that, do I label people? It's not that I label people, it's the church labels people. If the church says that a person is anathema or is a heretic for holding to certain propositions, that's not Michael Lofton labeling them, that's the magisterium labeling them. I have no authority to do that. The magisterium does that. So that's, of course, a strong man. But let me point out some other things here. All right, let me show you about a dozen videos. I'm not going to go through every one of the videos. I'm just going to show you the title here. Let me show you about a dozen videos I've done outlining these distinctions, right? You see the distinctions on your screen. Destructive criticism, constructive criticism, withholding, assent, dissent. These are things I've talked about numerous times in pretty much every one of the videos I'm about to show you. So what this tells me is, for people to misrepresent my position, it's inexcusable because I've covered it many times. But let me just show you. Share my screen once more. Okay. Can Catholic bishops dissent against the magisterium? Notice the term I'm using there. Okay, dissent. And in that video, I go through the question of Constantinople IV and what it says about the matter. This is not Michael Lofton. This is an ecumenical council. Michael Lofton is not Constantinople IV. Constantinople IV is a group of 100 or so bishops in Constantinople between 869 and 870. That's not Michael Lofton. Okay. So what it says in Canon 21 and elsewhere about dissent, that's not my opinion. It's the opinion of an ecumenical council. Okay. So if you're going to criticize the Catholic Church on the question of dissent, just know you're criticizing an ecumenical council, not Michael Lofton. Okay. So I go through those distinctions there in that video. In this one, Canon 212 does not allow for public dissent. I go through these distinctions again. I show the difference between dissent, withholding assent, versus criticism. And I show that Canon 212, it allows for dissent. I'm sorry, it allows for criticism. It does not allow for dissent. It rejects that. Not only that, several popes, and again, Donum Veritatis rejects it. You can even see here in the description where I'm telling people I'm going through Donum Veritatis. This is a document by the church that I've done many lectures on, many lectures, many shows on, many streams on. We even got a whole video reading Donum Veritatis in audio to people. So if you don't want to sit here and read it, great. We got a whole show called Donum Veritatis where we just read it. But many others where commentary is offered. Okay. Now we also talk about other things like Lumen Gentium 37. I get obviously into the Code of Canon Law, Canon 212, and I make all these appropriate distinctions. Here's another one: public dissent against the church, repeating the same mistakes. And here I do the same thing. I go through the distinctions, relevant distinctions: dissent, withholding assent, criticism. Did the same thing in this one called the Catholic Church on Magisterial Dissent. And I go through Catholic sources on the question of dissent. I touch on Casti Connubii, Sapientia Christianae. These are some preconciliar documents. I go through the manualists, preconciliar manualists on public dissent. By the way, they're all against it. I go through how did we get to the point where assent and dissent, dissent is accepted. How did we get to that point? Well, I go through the German bishops rejecting Humanae Vitae, among others. That's where it started with liberalism. Okay. In this one, can Eastern Catholics dissent from the magisterium? I've heard some Eastern Catholics ignorantly say that they don't have to hold to some of the dogmas of the Latins or this and that. And in reality, not only the Code of Canon Law for the Eastern Catholic churches says that Eastern Catholics have to accept the same doctrines, they also offer the same penalties as for Latin Rite Catholics when they dissent. I go through all that, as you can see here in this video. And of course, I'm making the appropriate distinctions. What about this one? This is throwback thumbnail. Look at that. Pope Paul VI on dissent from Vatican II. I go over the question of Paul VI and his response to the Lefebvrites who were dissenting against Vatican II. What about this one? Dissent under the guise of piety. In this video, I go through the question of dissent and how some people will, whether they are philosophers or Catholic priests, I'll go through how some of them present themselves as pious people whenever they dissent against the magisterium. And I show that, wait, actually dissent is not piety. It's not pious. It's forbidden. So I'll go through it in that video. What about this one? When Catholic PhDs drink the Kool-Aid of dissent. And I go through similar stuff to the previous video. What about this one? The authority of synods and dissenting from popes. In this video, I make all those necessary distinctions. In fact, that's the video that we got this YouTube short from. Can we criticize a pope? So in that video, I'm making the proper distinctions. Yes, you could criticize constructively, but you can't dissent. And that is different from withholding assent. And that's different from destructive criticism. Okay, what about this one? Karl Rahner, the German bishops in public dissent from the magisterium. What I do here is I show how Rahner and the German bishops are partly responsible for the massive problem of dissent. Okay, there's that. This one, hyper-papalism, papal maximalism, and papal minimalism. I go through this because, there's a lot of people who straw man the Catholic position as hyper-papalist. And in reality, it's actually just the Catholic magisterium's position. Of course, they'll misrepresent what that position is, though. And they'll say that it's a position that says you can't criticize Pope. You never criticize bishops. And they'll say, this is hyper-papalism. And it's like, well, okay, if that's what you mean, then nobody in the history of mankind has ever said that. To my knowledge, like, nobody believes that you can't criticize Pope, right? That's just a straw man. Okay. So I go through how that's a straw man, and I show what the position of the magisterium actually is. In this video, I address some of the people, like the Pints with Aquinas episode that straw man my position. I think it was in the interview with Jimmy Akin. I was completely misrepresented multiple times on that. And I was, strawmanned as if I believe that anybody who is confused by what's going on in the church or Pope Francis, they get no sympathy from Lofton. That's just not my position. And anybody who's ever watched the channel knows that's just bearing false witness. Okay, so I go through that and I show, no, that's not true. Confused by Pope Francis? I completely understand. And I go through some of these distinctions that we're talking about today there. What about this one? Breaking. Pope Francis says all religions are paths to God. In this one, I offer some constructive criticism of Pope Francis. Okay, so anybody who says, Michael, you never criticize the Pope, well, I don't know, I do it multiple times a week, but here's just one example. I did a follow-up stream to this one, by the way, because in a follow-up stream, Pope Francis affirmed that Jesus is the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father except through him. And I say, hey, this is okay, but I still offer some more constructive criticism of Pope Francis, even in that follow-up stream. Okay. So if somebody is out there saying, Michael, you just believe that you can't criticize Pope, it's just not honest. It's not sincere. So if somebody's out there telling you that, you really need to question that person. Because if they were sincere, they could have easily found out what my position was. And by the way, those weren't exhaustive in nature. I got a whole lot more videos about these topics. Those are just a few that I pulled up. But let's talk about them a little bit more. Again, for good measure. Let's go through it again. We've seen destructive criticism forbidden. Let's maybe go to the Catechism of the Catholic Church. Let's look up. Let's go through slander, gossip, bearing false witness. Let's go through that. Let me pull it up here. Let's take a look at 2477. Okay. These would be categorized as destructive criticism. Okay. Camelot says, Michael, my favorite waffler. I don't know what you're talking about. I can't get any more clear than this. If you think that's waffling, I can't help you. Okay. Respect for the repudiation of persons forbids every attitude and word likely to cause them unjust injury. He becomes guilty of rash judgment, even tacitly, assumes as true without sufficient foundation the moral fault of a neighbor. This is often present in a lot of destructive criticism. Somebody is engaging in rash judgment, assuming without sufficient foundation the fault of a neighbor. It's grave matter. Okay. Detraction is often very much related to the question of destructive criticism. Detraction is the sin of, without objectively valid reason, disclosing another's faults and failings to the person who did not know them without a valid reason. Okay. Calumny, by remarks contrary to the truth, harms the reputation of others, and gives occasion for false judgments concerning them. Okay. So this is harming the reputation of others with remarks contrary to the truth. So the remarks are not true. Or gives occasions for false judgments concerning them. So a perfect example of calumny would be those who say, Michael Lofton, you believe that you can't criticize a pope. And then they'll straw man me and ridicule me over a ridiculous straw man. Okay, that's calumny, right? All right, so that's destructive criticism. And then it goes over the need to avoid these problems, these sins. Certainly welcome to take a look at them. But those are often behind destructive criticism. There's an assumption that's unwarranted. There's a bearing of false witness. There's a disclosing of information that wasn't warranted. And others. Those are just a few examples of what is associated with destructive criticism. Obviously, that's not allowed, right? Because clearly those are sins. So that's never allowed. Constructive criticism, however. Well, let's maybe start with Canon 212. Let's go there again. Share my screen. Okay. Let's go over here to paragraph 3 of Canon 212. So it says, according to the knowledge, competence, and prestige which they possess, they have the right, and even at times the duty, to manifest to the sacred pastors their opinions on matters which pertain to the good of the church, and to make their opinion known to the rest of the faithful. Now, you remember what I said in that comment over here? I said it's not a grave sin to criticize a bishop, let alone for a bishop to do it. It's actually sinful not to in this particular case. Why did I say that? Well, because I have Canon 212.3 in mind, right? That's what I'm talking about right here. It also says, without prejudice to the integrity of faith and morals, with reverence towards their pastors. Okay, so notice what's excluded here. Destructive criticism, right? So destructive criticism is not going to be reverence towards one's pastor. So clearly that one's not in scope. But some kind of criticism is in scope, is being authorized, making an opinion known if it pertains to the good of the church, and they can make it known not only to their pastor, but to the rest of the Christian faithful. And that will be on things like social media, right? Because you don't have everybody's email address. Okay. You can't contact 1.3 billion Catholics via email unless you have a really amazing mailing list. So how would you do that? Well, social media. With reverence towards their pastors and attentive to common advantage and the dignity of persons. Dignity of persons. Being respectful. Not being destructive in nature. Okay. So here's a very clear example of Canon 212 allowing for it. I've gone in that other video in more detail. This one, Canon 212, does not allow for public dissent. In that, I went into more detail and I show the sources for this canon. And I show those sources explicitly forbid dissent. They allow for criticism, constructive criticism, but they explicitly forbid dissent. And I'll walk you through the sources and show you them on the screen. That's, by the way, something that I do that I notice my critics don't. I always show my sources on the screen so you can double check me. And if I'm criticizing somebody, always show you what they say in their own words. I don't repeat them. I don't say, here's what so-and-so said, and then completely misrepresent them. No. I show you their words on the screen, and then I interact with them. That way, if I'm misrepresenting them, you can check me in real time right then and there because I'm doing the shows live. Okay. That's what an honest person does. A dishonest person won't actually show you what the other person that they're critiquing says. They'll misrepresent them, and then they'll knock down the straw man. Okay. Don't fall for that. Don't fall for that trap. And if you see anybody doing it, I don't care if they're a cardinal, a bishop, a priest, a deacon, a layman, or whatever in the world you can conceive of. I don't care. If they're not doing that, this is not a person who is being honest. This is not a person of integrity. Keep that in mind. Well, back to it. Let's now talk about withholding assent. Withholding assent. So when we go to Donum Veritatis, let me pull it up here, show y'all. Okay. In this section right here, section 4, it goes over the theologian and his relationship to the magisterium. In fact, that's what the theme of the document is. Why was this written? Well, at the time, there were a lot of liberals rejecting teachings of the magisterium under the guise of, well, they're non-definitive in nature. They're non-definitive teachings, so I can reject it. And they were engaging in dissent. So this document was written to balance things out. And in this section, you need to read the entire section in its entirety, 21 through 31. It talks about how in rare cases a theologian can withhold assent. You can see that especially in paragraph 31. And this is obviously a reference to non-definitive teachings. Okay, it's not in relation to withholding assent for a dogmatic teaching or a definitive Catholic doctrine. Which, by the way, the various levels of teachings are outlined here around paragraph 17 onward. But if you look at paragraph 31, it says it can also happen that at the conclusion of a serious study, so this is not flippant, not out of nowhere, conclusion of a serious study undertaken with the desire to heed the magisterium's teaching without hesitation. So not with an intention of dismissing the church, but really with trying to understand it. The theologian, not just a YouTuber, the theologian. The theologian's difficulty remains because the arguments to the contrary seem more persuasive to him. Faced with a proposition to which he feels he cannot give his intellectual assent, the theologian nevertheless has the duty to remain open to deeper examination of the question. So what it's talking about is in this rare case, you might be able to withhold assent. That is, you do not assent to the teaching that you're having difficulty with, the non-definitive teaching, rare cases. But that's not the same as dissent. Now, what is dissent? Well, paragraph 32 through 41 has a whole section on the question of dissent and how it's never authorized. And it goes over the problem of dissent. It notes how dissent is actually modernist. So even your trads, when they dissent, are ironically behaving as modernists, according to this document. It shows where it came from, where this ideology, modernist ideology, comes from. It outlines how this is forbidden, cannot be done by anyone. Highly recommend you read through it all or watch any of my videos covering it. But what this is saying is going on YouTube, writing letters, going on the radio, TV show program, writing a book in whatever media form you want, saying that the church's teaching is wrong, rejecting it, teaching against it, condemning it, any of the above forbidden. Because there's a difference between I'm unable to assent to this, though I'm still willing and open to assent to it, versus I'm rejecting it and now speaking and teaching against it. You see the difference? That's the difference between assent or withholding assent and dissent. That's the difference. Maybe that's a subtle distinction, but it's crucial. And it's not a distinction that I'm coming up with. This isn't Loftonism. This isn't something I'm making up. I'm pointing you to what the magisterium says. Now, if you don't like it, okay, hey, you know what? There's a lot of Protestant churches, a lot of Eastern Orthodox churches who will welcome you with open arms. And they'll say, welcome home, brother. We've been saying this for 1,000 years. There's a lot of other Christian communities out there who would agree with you. If you don't like this, they would agree with you and say, yeah, we don't like this either. That's why we started our churches. And they will welcome you with open arms. But don't disingenuously attempt to portray this as someone's opinion when in reality it's what the magisterium teaches. And if you don't like it, okay, just be honest about that. But if you're going to call yourself a Catholic, a traditional Catholic, a faithful Catholic, that includes accepting what the magisterium teaches. Okay. Now, by way of review, again, Acts of Constantinople, Council of Constantinople 4, 869, 870. Got a whole lecture on it with CPU. If y'all want to sign up for that course at some time. I know I have a lot of videos on it here on YouTube as well for free. But let's briefly recap Canon 21. Photius had previously condemned the Pope, saying the Pope was a heretic, teaching the heresy of the Filioque, condemning him for all sorts of petty stuff. Wrote out a letter to the patriarchs condemning him, accusing him of heresy. Then assembled in a council in 867 and synodally condemned him. This is a council 2 years later that assembles in Constantinople to discipline Photius. In that council in Canon 21, a canon is put forward forbidding anyone to judge the Pope. Not new to this council. We had seen that previously with Pope Gelasius, for instance. And that's where, in fact, you get from the Code of Canon Law, the first see is judged by no one. Really, you see that first with Gelasius. Then you see it definitely reasserted, 869, 870. Continues through canon law until the modern day Code of Canon Law in 1983. So they passed a canon saying it's forbidden to judge Pope. What are they talking about? They're not talking about criticizing him. They're talking about saying the Pope is teaching heresy. That's judging the Pope. Because that's what was the context behind the canon. Because that's what Photius did. They were condemning when Photius did this. And they were clear. It's not just whenever you do this in a council. It's not just synodally. It's also if you write tracts or sermons, publish sermons, or just speak out, preach and say that the Pope is teaching heresy. They're clear to note all of that is forbidden. And for anyone who does this, they cannot inherit eternal life. That's not Michael Loftonism. That's the Council of Constantinople 4. If you don't like it, take it up with these guys. I'm just telling you what they said. If you disagree, fine. Hey, a lot of Eastern Orthodox disagree. Okay, a lot of Protestants disagree. But that is what an ecumenical council for the Catholic Church says. People who do this cannot inherit eternal life. They're anathema. They share in the anathema of Dioscorus and Photius. And again, it's not just for people who do this in a synod. It's for anybody who does it anywhere, in any kind of form. Writings, preaching, teaching, whatever. Getting on YouTube. They didn't have YouTube then, but you know what I mean. All of that, according to the council, forbidden. And it says the only case where a pope can be judged is by another pope. Now you might say, wait, I thought there's only one pope at a time. Right. What it's talking about is a living pope judging a predecessor pope who's already deceased. That's what it's talking about. And they give the council of the Sixth Ecumenical Council as an example in the case of Honorius. And they say at this council, the council was united to Leo II, who had condemned Honorius. So in this case, if you have a pope with a council who's condemning a predecessor, that's fine. But if the council doesn't have a pope backing it, that's prohibited. That's the difference between Photius's synod that's condemned and Constantinople III that is affirmed at this council. Okay, so that's the only exception to the rule. The first see is judged by no one. You can't go out there and say the Pope is teaching heresy. The Pope is a heretic. You can't do that. But there is that one exception, and it's another Pope. That's why if you look at some variants in the Code of Canon Laws, I've often pointed out, historically, we'll hear the first see is judged by no one. And in some variations of that canon, there would be an attached clause, except in the case of heresy or something like that. But this council is explicit. That clause is for a pope to do, not for a layman, not for a bishop, not for a patriarch. It's explicit. Nobody can do it except the pope. Okay. So that's another one that goes against dissent. And every single time I explain that to people, I always get the same feedback. Oh, that's so stupid. That means you can't criticize the Pope. No, that's not what that means. Let's look at it again. Destructive criticism, constructive criticism, withholding assent, and dissent. Not the same thing. And if you don't know the distinction, might I just humbly say, you don't belong in the conversation then. Okay? You need to study this first before you can offer a constructive comment. If you don't know the difference, you don't know the distinctions, you don't belong to the conversation. You haven't earned a seat at the table. It's like me trying to go to a stream on YouTube with two doctors who are brain surgeons and trying to tell them, actually, I think that you should have done this brain surgery this way and that way. I haven't earned a seat at that table. I don't know what I'm talking about. I don't know the procedures. They'd eat my lunch in that discussion. Okay. Well, the same applies over here. You know, if you want to judge the Pope, you want to do all that. Okay. Make sure you understand all this first. Make sure you understand that at the very least before you insert yourself into these discussions. And if you don't know these distinctions, you don't belong in this discussion. You haven't earned that place. And it would be wise to just be silent and learn first. Listen, pay attention, learn. That's the wise thing to do. And then after you've learned, then you might, perhaps, maybe be in a position to offer something constructive. Okay. All right, so now that we've covered this for the 50th time on the stream, I hope this really helps because I see so many people making these mistakes and going from one extreme to the other. You know what I've actually seen? Not only do you have that group that says, Michael, what are you talking about? You can't, you say that you can't criticize the Pope. Straw man. Okay. But on the other hand, I've seen the opposite extreme. And I've seen the very opposite end of people saying, Michael, how dare you criticize the Pope or the bishops? I get those too. How dare you do that? You can't criticize the Pope or the bishops. You've changed. I haven't changed, but they just weren't paying attention. Or they had a misunderstanding of my position, and now when they're confronted with reality, they think I've changed. No, you're just experiencing cognitive dissonance because you're misinformed. I haven't changed. Both of those are extremes that we need to avoid. The people who say every single word that the Pope utters is perfect, never can criticize it, obviously that's ridiculously stupid. And we need to avoid that. Okay? Avoid stupidity. At the same time, the other extreme that wants to say, oh, so you're saying you can never criticize the Pope. Got to avoid that too. Got to avoid that too. The people who are confusing criticism with dissent, they're playing this shell game with you. It's a bait and switch. They'll engage in dissent, which is condemned by the church. But then when you call them out for it, they'll switch. They'll do the shell game. And then they'll say, oh, so you're saying you can't criticize the Pope? That's ridiculous. Look at so and so saint who criticized the Pope. Look at Catherine Siena who did it. Well, you think you're better than a saint? You owe these saints an apology. This is stupidity. This is stupidity. And it's dishonest because the shell game is going on. What they did is a bait and switch. They attempted to justify public dissent with the notion of criticism. And by the way, I just have to point out, the same people who engage in this stuff, if they ever criticize the Pope or the bishops, it's never your constructive criticism. It's always the destructive criticism. Okay. Always the destructive. So even then, even if we were to grant, okay, well, you can criticize, even then, the form of their criticism is always destructive. It's always the kind that's forbidden. It's never the kind that's allowed. I'm trying to see myself on the screen to see where it is. Constructive criticism. Okay. If this doesn't get the message through, if this doesn't communicate the distinctions, I don't know if anything ever will. But if you want to see more in-depth dives at all these, certainly welcome to go and watch all those shows I showed you at the beginning on my screen there and many more. Perhaps I'll put links to every one of those in the show notes here for easy access so y'all don't have to go and look it up and type it in and all that. I'll put it in there. All right, let me grab some chat questions. Y'all feel free to put them in the chat. Make sure to put them to @Reason and Theology. I will join y'all in just a moment after grabbing me some coffee and grab just a few chat questions. Okay, I'll be. Are you ready to deepen your faith and sharpen your understanding of theology? Welcome to the Center for Theological Research, your gateway to transformative learning. At CTR, you will find in-depth courses designed to equip you with the tools to grow in your understanding of the faith. Explore courses like the 7 Ecumenical Councils and uncover the foundational truths that shape Christianity. Master the ability to determine the level of a doctrine in the Theological Notes course. And in the Logical Fallacies and Apologetics course, you'll learn to spot the logical errors often encountered in non-Catholic apologetics content. Also, check out the ebooks that are available to you for free. Start your journey today. Visit ctresearch.org and take the next step in your faith formation. All right. So before I grab those, let me just say this. I got a lot of critics, and I think that's fine to be criticized. I criticize others. I attempt to do so constructively. I criticize others, and I think it's perfectly fair for people thus to criticize me. I think that's legit. But what I've noticed is, to the man, every single one of my critics, they don't criticize my actual positions. They criticize strawmans. I don't understand that. Because in my case, With all of these critics, I'll pull them up on the screen and show them to you. And I'll let them speak in their own words, and then I'll criticize that. But to the man, they won't do the same with me. They won't actually represent me accurately and then critique it. I welcome that. I welcome people to critique my actual positions, not to critique a straw man. And I also welcome my critics to come on this show live, not pre-recorded, live for everyone to see. Let's have a chat. I think you'll find that my positions are very different than how you perceive them. Okay. Yeah, this is funny. Meanwhile, they're criticizing other areas of the Catholic Church. This is weird because I find it odd that some people are upset that I've constructively criticized, as the magisterium allows me to do, some of the dissenters, some of the heretics, some of the schismatics, according to the judgment of the church. They're upset with me doing that, but for some reason they can call the Pope a heretic every day. It's weird how that works, right? They can bash the Pope as a heretic every day. They can lie about the Pope every day, slander the Pope every day. That's perfectly acceptable. But if you accurately represent them fairly and show that they're actually a heretic, you're anathema. What is that? What is that? I don't know. But yeah, I agree with you, AY. Okay, let's see. Matthew says, wouldn't withholding assent imply the proposition is evil, or at least deficient to the extent of harming souls? No, neither. But the document does say that bishops have not always taken into account. Let me actually find it. Paragraph 24.3. One of my favorite paragraphs. I feel like I have it memorized at this point. When it comes to questions of the intervention in the prudential order, it could happen that some magisterial documents might not be free from all deficiencies. But just because they might not be free from all deficiencies doesn't necessarily mean it's something harmful to souls. Okay. Bishops and their advisors have not always taken into immediate consideration every aspect or the entire complexity of a question. But it doesn't mean that automatically what they've done is so egregious that it's automatically destructive to souls. But it would be contrary to truth if, proceeding from some particular cases, one were to conclude that the church's magisterium can be habitually mistaken in its prudential judgments, or that it doesn't enjoy divine assistance in the integral exercise of its mission. So then the point is, this divine assistance is here obviously for non-definitive acts. What is that divine assistance? Obviously, it's not infallibility, right? Because we're talking about non-infallible acts. So what kind of divine assistance are we talking about? Well, I've spoken about it numerous times. A charism of safety. Okay. But yeah, just because they haven't taken everything into account doesn't automatically mean it's somehow destructive to souls. Now, when it comes to things that are destructive to souls, negligence can be very destructive to souls. If the magisterium fails to correct a major problem in the church, that could be very destructive to souls. Right? Negligence. It's a real thing. Happened many times in church history. One can argue it's currently happening right now. Okay. Another thing is scandalous behavior. That's destructive to souls. You know, members of the magisterium can do scandalous things that harm souls, right? If the Pope engages in fornication, that's very scandalous. That's very harmful to souls. Even though he didn't lift a finger of the magisterium, a member of the magisterium has just scandalized and harmed the souls of many people by scandalous behavior. Okay, so members of the magisterium can do a great deal of harm to souls. The question then is, can non-definitive teachings in and of themselves, the teachings, not the persons, the teachings, be destructive to souls? That's a different question, because there's a difference between persons and teachings. Okay. Keep that in mind too. I know that wasn't part of your question, but I'm just mentioning that for others who are watching who might not be aware of the distinction. Okay, Mahovel, thank you so much for that super chat. He says, most of them, I guess we're talking about the critics, not only that they attack straw men, but they also do it absolutely without any traces of charity and they go to ad hominem. Right. Well, it tells me that I must be doing something right to threaten the dissenters this much. Let's see what else we got here. There's a fine line between criticize and just seething in apostasy, Christ bears says. It's a good way to put it. I tend to see the latter. Yeah. Kimmy says, all religions are path to God is a heretical statement, no matter what, whatever, which council may say this is bluntly heretical. Well, I criticized it, but let me say this. Does the statement Jesus doesn't know the day or the hour of his second coming, is that bluntly heretical? Some might say yes, and yet that's exactly what Jesus said, right? You can rip things out of context and make them as absolute heresy if you want, but you're going to have a really tough time getting through the New and Old Testament if you do that. You got to be a little bit more fair than that. That being said, what he said was very, 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 very appropriate to be criticized, and I did just that. But I do put it in proper perspective so that you can accurately criticize it and not inaccurately criticize it. My problem is, look, in reality, there are, sadly, a lot of things to criticize about Pope Francis, but we can't get to what those criticisms are 99% of the time because we're so distracted with unfair and false and slanderous accusations against the Pope. We're having to swat those away that we can't actually get to the real ones. So I'm just saying, for all y'all papal critics, if you actually want to be productive, limit yourself to accurate criticisms of Pope Francis. There's plenty of material. Limit yourself to those. But when you go to inaccurate criticisms and stuff like that, you're doing yourself a disservice because then we can't get to the real issues. Paul says, I would like to thank Michael Lofton for helping me choose the Catholic faith. I was in RCIA when Fiducia Supercons came out. That's awesome to hear, Paul. Thank you so much. I appreciate that you posted that and that the content was helpful to you. That's awesome. Okay. Does anyone else think it's bizarre that defending the Pope is viewed as a flaw? Yes, I do. Especially in light of the fact that numerous popes throughout history have said that's an absolute obligation of all Catholics. For some reason, the Catholic position now is seen as weird. So if you are holding to the Catholic position, people see you as part of a cult. Now, I'm talking about here Catholics. Catholics see you as part of the cult because they don't recognize their own faith because they're so poorly catechized, especially in the area of ecclesiology. And so I think that is truly, truly sad. Not only that, it's wild. It's surreal to watch some of these content creators praise Anglican ministers while condemning magisterial defenders. That's surreal. Like, actually, I saw a video earlier today from a dissenter praising an Anglican minister while simultaneously condemning magisterial defenders. And he claims to be Catholic. It's like, wow, the level of confusion is so bad that the people who actually hold to the magisterium are seen as evil and wrong and in error. And the people who actually dissent from the magisterium and aren't even in communion with the church are seen as somehow good and virtuous. By the way, that's another lie. Talking about communion with the church. A lot of people lie and just say I'm a new convert. It's so hilarious every time I see that. It's like, why do they do that? I became Catholic in 2012. From 2017 to 2019, I spent 3 years in Eastern Orthodoxy. But that was 2017 to 2019. Converted in 2012. You do the math. Is that a new convert? You tell me. Paul says, Michael's explanation of Fiducia Supercons made me remain in RCIA. Wow. So some good came from it, right? It's like 70 different videos on that particular topic. That's probably the one I had to tackle the most. Probably biggest controversy in this papacy. There's another one for you. There's real criticisms to be leveled against fiducia, but we can't get to them because we have to deal with fake criticisms of it all the time. And the fake criticisms are, way, way, way worse than what the thing they're actually criticizing. And so we end up getting so distracted and putting to rest the lies that we can't get to the real criticisms of fiducia, which none of the critics have picked up on. Okay, Kimmy says, I love the papacy. That's the reason why I am critical. Let's see. Got another comment here. Good news. In OCIA, a seminarian was teaching on Eucharist. When questions come up on hand versus tongue, he said, follow Rome. When in doubt, follow Rome. Yeah, I got a lot of videos on that one too. That's another one where there's a lot of confusion. How is it that Taylor Marshall can get away with criticizing the Pope and not get any reprimand? That's a good question. Also, why is it that your Taylor Marshalls of the world can bash the Pope every single day and nobody bats an eye? And yet, when I call people to assent to the magisterium, I get attacked left and right for it. That's weird. That's weird. It's popular to bash and lie about the Pope, but if you dare to call people to do something Catholic like assent to the magisterium, that person's anathema and they will be dragged up and down all over social media. It's weird to see that from Catholics. I expect that from Protestants. I expect that from Eastern Orthodox. I expect that from non-Christians. I don't expect that from Catholics. That is so weird that we're at a point right now in the Catholic Church where doing something Catholic is seen as anathema. And doing something anathema is seen as Catholic. I don't know what to say about that. And I don't know what can really be done until Pope Francis and the bishops really, really address that crisis. Big Sack says, I've seen this, Michael, sadly. Yes. Yes. A priest on YouTube made a great point about former seminarians who are now anti-Catholic. That's sad. Okay, so Jeff says, my big problem with fraternal correction of the Pope is that it's supposed to be done person to person, not in public. No, if we're talking about constructive criticism, Canon 212 does allow for that to be public. It doesn't have to be face-to-face. If, however, we are talking about destructive criticism, that's never allowed. If we are talking about dissent, that's never allowed. If we're talking about withholding assent, that can be done privately, and one should discuss that with their pastor. And also constructive criticism could be done privately, right? That is an option per Canon 212. It is an option, but it's not something that one is limited to. Please keep that in mind. When it comes to constructive criticism for Canon 212, it is not that you have to only offer it in private, face-to-face. No. You can offer it to the rest of the faithful as well. But it needs to be constructive. That's not the same as what EWTN is doing, by the way. EWTN with the world over and stuff like that, they're going beyond constructive criticism. They're going into what we call destructive criticism and dissent, right? The ones that are absolutely condemned by the church, these two right here. They're doing those two. Okay. Keep that in mind. Okay. Ryan says, God bless, Michael, reading Bellarmine right now. Sounds very familiar. Indeed. That's good reading. Taylor Marshall is losing appeal. Is he? I haven't really seen much of his content in quite a while. Okay. Well, I think I grabbed everything. Let me make sure I didn't miss any super chats. All right. Paul says it's hot garbage. I agree. It really is. Anyways, hey, thank y'all so much for watching. Hopefully this was helpful. Hopefully we're very clear on these distinctions, and it will be inexcusable for viewers of the Michael Lofton Show to not know these distinctions at this point, right? Inexcusable. if you don't know it in the future, you'll be anathematized. No, I'm just joking. But it really is like to the point that I don't know what else can be done if this doesn't help. All right, that's gonna do it. Everybody hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, leave your comments in the comment section. I want to hear your feedback. See you later. God bless. Hey, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, the like button, and if you want to support the channel, visit patreon.com/reason and theology.